Deep Into History is independent and proudly listener-supported. Before we begin, I would like to thank my newest patrons, Jillian, Arthur, and Amber, who went to patreon.com/deepintohistory and attained the rank of historian for just 10 cents a day. Thank you for helping keep Deep Into History independent and ad-free. Amber, Arthur, and Jillian, my new historians, I salute you and thank you from the center of my being. A special thank you to Brian, who generously raised his level of support. Brian, your contribution to the show is peerless. A quick shout out to the winners of a contest I held on Twitter, who correctly identified the painting of the Battle of Versailles that we'll be experiencing very soon. Congratulations, Tarma Hartley, Lon Graham, and Pakuku. Consider this a foreword. This is the third full episode of my epic series Verses. If you haven't listened to the first 2 parts, stop this now and go back and listen, as I will only be giving the briefest of recaps before we continue our tale, and we will pick up exactly where our main heroes, or villains, depending on your point of view, left off. Thank you so much for your patience in the release of this episode. Blending those 2 very different stories from our past together while maintaining the tempo and tone was challenging. In addition, the sheer amount of research required to get as many details in our coming points of view sections exactly right took far more time and effort than it ever had before. The result? Well, you tell me. I believe I have achieved something absolutely unique in the history of podcasting. The speeches and dialogue in most of our tale to be are pulled directly from the history books and are the words of the men themselves, brought to life once again after 2 millennia. Consider that as we go forward. And with that said, this forward comes to an end. This is Deep Into History, and I'm your host, Arjun Hundal. In the year 107 before the Common Era, the Republic of Rome stands astride the Mediterranean world like a colossus. With the fall of Numantia, Hispania has been pacified, and its vast wealth is flowing into the already bursting coffers of the Senate and people of the Republic of Rome. While not exactly the people, the elite have hoarded the wealth of the Republic's conquests, with slaves having literally taken their jobs, predatory moneylenders seizing their humble farms when they could no longer keep up with the usurious interest rates. The streets of Rome teem with the rural-turned-urban poor, the plebs, the mob. Tension between the people of Rome, the populares, and the nobility, the optimates, has never been more tense. Blood has been spilt. Lives have been lost in the class struggle. Yet whenever meaningful reforms seem possible for the people, just within reach, the awesome power of the optimates with their near limitless wealth would fall like a hammer, often killing plebeian leaders and their most ardent supporters, crushing years of efforts from the movement for change. However, something in the air of the streets has changed. For months, a name mentioned at first in polite conversations, and then in large gatherings, then on the lips of every pleb and equestrian in Rome, spoken in that most intoxicating of tones, Speas, hope. For the plebs have just found their champion, a hero to the people of Rome as Achilles was to the Greeks. His epic feats on the battlefields of the Jugurthine War have become the stuff of legend, with groups of children reenacting Jugurtha's nearly perfect ambush as the marching legions approached the Methul River. The children always arguing who would get to play him on that famous charge a year before, where after an entire day of battle, he rallied 2,000 legionaries collapsed from exhaustion on a hill and led one of the most famous charges in the storied histories of the legions of Rome, not only saving the life of the consul, but of every soldier on the battlefield, turning imminent defeat into victory. The greatest warrior of the late Republic, Gaius Marius, stood with them, and they had just elected him consul in a landslide. They now had an ally, one of them, at the pinnacle of power. Not only that, once elected, Marius had had the tribunes of the plebs lift the requirements of owning land to join the legions. All knew of the seemingly limitless gold of Jugurtha. After all, they had witnessed him bribe the entire nobility of the city more than once. Now they, the poor, could share in the riches, the plunder, the spoils. With the wealth they earned, they could come home rich, or as Marius had promised, be given land of their own to farm. A chance to forge a decent life for themselves and their families. Speas, hope. However, all is not well. The Optimates, led by the ultra-powerful Caecili Metelli clan, whose head Metellus was still with his legions in Africa, had just lost his imperium to conduct the war against Jugurtha to Marius, a huge insult and a threat to their power. Since his election, they have been using their massive patronage network of thousands of elite and equestrian followers to saturate the streets of Rome with a counter-narrative, to diminish their enemy Gaius Marius in the eyes of the people. Whispers that his legendary feats on the battlefield were a result of wild lies told by his clients became talk that the Marians had lied to them, and turned to arguments that no man was capable of such deeds, that it was in fact an insult to the legions to suggest that Marius had saved them. He was just a man, one among tens of thousands. Worse followed. The Optimates bribed any wounded veterans, whether they had served in Numidia or not, to tell tales of the savagery and horror that awaited anyone who would join the legions and go with Marius to Africa, at the hands of the cunning Jugurtha, his terrifying screamers, and his thousands of dreaded Numidian cavalry. The plebs began to believe that their lives may be difficult and without dignity in Rome, but surely it was far better than certain death. That small flame of speas, hope, looked about to be extinguished, and the consulship of Gaius Marius, a failure before it truly could be said to have begun. So come dream with me as we become one with Gaius Marius and experience the moment upon which everything hinged, an appeal to the citizens of Rome and a devastating attack on the nobility, in his own words. Ready? Then let's go. You are standing on the dais of the tribunes in the Forum Romanum. The benches behind you are empty, for not even your allies, the tribunes of the plebs, are willing to risk their popularity, or perhaps even their lives, if you fail in your mission this day. The campaign of disinformation of the Optimates against you, coupled with the complete lack of support of any major patronus in the city, has left you without recruits for the legions you must lead back to Africa to end the war with Jugurtha. This should have been an easy task given your vast popularity with the people, and having removed the restriction of owning land as a requirement, should have had your recruitment officers overwhelmed with citizens eager for the chance to fight and earn a decent standard of living. Yet it seems you have miscalculated badly. You had reasoned that once elected, having defeated all Optimate candidates for the consulship, your political fight in Rome would be over until you returned victorious from the war raging in Africa. But the affront to the Caecili Metelli, the most powerful noble family in Rome, your sworn enemies, in removing the imperium from Metellus in Africa and giving you control of the war, had caused the entire upper class to unite as they never had before. Not even the equestrians, men of your class, would dare support you openly now for fear of the wrath of the nobles. Before you, all around you, the entire forum is packed with tens of thousands of citizens, nearly all plebs. Every balcony and every road leading here is packed solid. They have come at your call to hear you speak. Normally you would have been greeted with resounding cheers, but there is an eerie silence. The propaganda of the nobles has instilled fear in their hearts, where just a week before had been the most wonderful emotion to behold. Speas, hope. Many now thought you a liar. Your deeds as a warrior you had performed your entire adult life had been erased from their minds. So completely and utterly had the lies about you spread that they penetrated every conversation in every corner of the city. Now in the minds of these people, who had joyously voted you in as consul, was nothing but doubt. They now thought that to journey with you and join your legions and serve under you a death sentence. The looks of betrayal in the eyes of the plebs closest to you is heartrending. You had rehearsed and memorized the speech, practicing it over and over in front of your beloved Julia Maria. But as you look out at the massive crowd, the glare from those thousands of pairs of eyes, the prepared speech completely slips from your mind. You feel small and terrified in a way you had not felt since you were a boy, since the cave of the Sibyl. The day she had given you the prophecy that Jupiter, king of Olympus, had decreed that you would attain the pinnacle of power, the consulship, 7 times, an impossible, even unlawful task. You involuntarily shudder at the memory of what happened next. So you raise your eyes to the sky, only to see an eagle circling directly above you. And suddenly, your confidence soars equally high at this confirmation that your destiny is in fact Jupiter's will. You push your shoulders back, breathe in deeply, and speak to your people. I know, fellow citizens, how election to a post of authority seems to change most men's characters. As candidates, they are full of energy, humbly entreat your support, and behave with moderation. Yet once elected, they become arrogant and slothful. To my mind, this is altogether wrong, in so much as the whole state is more important than a consulship or praetorship. More pains should be taken over its administration than in canvassing for these offices. I am well aware of the heavy responsibility which this great honor lays upon me. To prepare for war without exhausting the public treasury. To press into military service men who are anxious not to offend. To direct everything at home and abroad. To do this in the midst of jealousy, obstruction, and intrigue is a harder task than people imagine. My political opponents, if they make a mistake, can rely on protection on their ancient lineage, the resources of their relatives, marriage connections, and their numerous dependents. My hopes rest on myself, and I must sustain them with courage and uprightness, for I have nothing else to trust in. I too know that everyone's eyes are upon me, that fair-minded and patriotic men wish me well because my efforts are serviceable to our republic, while the nobles seek occasion to pounce on me. Wherefore I strive all the harder to frustrate their plans and prevent your being deceived. From my childhood to this day, I have lived so that every kind of toil and danger has been familiar to me, and what I did for nothing before you conferred these honors on me, I shall not cease to do now that I have received my reward. Restraint in the use of authority is not to be expected from men who have merely worn a mask of virtus in order to procure advancement. But I, having spent all my life in honorable pursuits, have so habituated myself to well-doing that it has become second nature to me. You have chosen me to conduct the war against Jugurtha, and this has greatly annoyed the nobility. Now consider whether it would be better to alter your decision. I mean to appoint for this or any similar work some nobleman, an optimate, a man with a long pedigree and a house full of family portraits, but without a single campaign to his credit, who is faced with a serious task, which he does not know the first thing about, will get excited and run about trying to find some commoner to instruct him in his duty. This is in fact what generally happens. The man you appoint to take command looks for another man to command him. I know myself of cases where a consul, after his election, has taken to studying history and Greek military treatises. This is the reversal of a natural order of things. For although you cannot discharge the powers of an office until you have been elected to it, the necessary practical experience should come first. Compare me, a new man, with these high and mighty ones. What they only know from hearsay or reading, I have seen with my own eyes, or done with my own hands. What they have learned out of books, I have learned on the battlefield. It is for you to judge whether words or deeds are more to the point. You hear murmurs of agreement and see nods in the crowds, and you lose yourself in your words. They scorn my lack of illustrious ancestors. I scorn their indolent habits. The worst that can be said of me is that I am a man of humble origin. They can be charged with acts of infamy. For my part, I believe that a man of virtus exhibits true nobility. If the fathers of the fool Albinus or Bessia could be asked if they would rather have had me or them for sons, what answer do you think they would give other than that they desired to have the best possible children? If these men think they have a right to look down on me, they are equally to look down on their ancestors, who like me had no nobility but what they earned by their merits. They are jealous of my virtus, but have no wish to share the life of austerity, toil, and years of danger by which I attained it. Eaten up with pride, they live as if they scorn the honors you, the people, can bestow, and then demand them of you with the air of men who have lived honorably. They are making a grave mistake if they think they can have it both ways, that they can enjoy both together things so incompatible as the pleasure of idleness or the rewards of honorable exertion. When they address you or the Senate, they spend most of their time praising their ancestors because they fondly imagine that by dwelling on their brave exploits, they enhance their own glory. On the contrary, the more illustrious the lives of their forefathers, the more shameful is their indolence. The truth is that ancestral glory is a torch that sheds a revealing light both on a man's virtues and his faults. I admit, citizens, I have nothing of this kind, but I have something much more glorious, deeds of my own that I can mention. See how unfair they are. Privilege they claim on other people's merits. They will not allow me the right of my own merits just because I have no family portraits to show and am a newcomer to the nobility of office. Yet surely it is better to have ennobled oneself than to have disgraced the nobility that one has inherited. I do not need to be told by my opponents, if they choose to reply to what I have said, are quite capable of making eloquent and elaborate speeches on the subject. But since they are seizing the occasion of this high honor that you have done to me to heap abuse on all of us, I have chosen to speak in case my silence can be taken for unworthiness. For myself indeed, and I can say this with all sincerity, no speeches can do me harm. For if they speak with truth, they cannot help but speak well of me, and any falsehood, my life and character will refute. But since they impugn all your judgment in assigning me such a high office, and so important a task, I advise you to consider again and yet again whether you will have cause to regret your choice. I, too, cannot justify your confidence in me by pointing to portraits, triumphs, or consulships of my ancestors. But if need be, I can show you spears, enemy banners, medals, and other military honors, to say nothing of the scars on my body, all of them in front. You ripped the folds of your toga away, displaying for all to see the long and brutal scars of years of war that had covered your upper arms, shoulders, chest, and stomach. Then hold out your arms and slowly rotate, showing your people that you do not have a single scar on your back, a living testament that you have never run while in battle. You face the crowd again, and you see eyes filled with tears as the people of Rome witness the blood you have shed for the Republic. You continue. These are my family portraits. These are my titles of nobility, not bequeathed to me as theirs were to them, but won at the cost of countless toils and perils. My true merit stands in no need of their approval, for it is plainly visible for all to see. It is my adversaries that require oratorial skill to help them cover up their turpitude. Nor have I studied Greek literature. I had no interest in studying the words of a defeated civilization. The knowledge I have acquired is that which I can use to serve Rome, to strike down an enemy with a gladius, to mount a proper guard on our legionary camps, to fear nothing but disgrace, to endure winter's cold or summer's heat with equal patience, to sleep on the bare ground, and to work hard on an empty stomach. These are the lessons I shall teach my soldiers, and I shall not let them go short while enjoying the best of everything myself, nor steal all the glory and leave them to toil. This is the proper way for a citizen to lead his fellow citizens. To live in luxury while subjecting one's army to rigorous discipline is to act like a tyrant instead of a commander. It was by conduct like mine that their ancestors won renown for themselves and for Rome. Relying on that renown to shed a reflected glory on them, these nobles who are so different in character from their ancestors despise us, who emulate their virtues and expect to receive all posts of honor from your hands, not because they deserve them, but as if they had a right to them. These proud men make a very big mistake. Their ancestors left them all they could, riches, family portrait busts, and their own glorious memory. Virtus they could not bequeath them, nor could they, for it is the only thing that no man can give to another, or receive for another. They call me vulgar and unpolished because I do not know how to put on an elegant dinner, and do not have famous actors at my table to entertain. Nor do I keep a cook that has cost me more than my farm. All this, my fellow Romans, I am proud to admit, for I was taught by my father and other great men, that while elegant graces befit a woman, a man's duty is to labor, that every good man should labor for honor rather than for riches, that the weapons he carries in his hands and not the furniture he keeps in his house are the ornaments most worth having. Well then, let them continue to do what pleases them, the love-making and drinking that they set so much store by. Let them spend their old age as they spent their youth, in the pleasures of the table, the sex slaves, the gluttony and lust. Let them leave the dust, the sweat, and the toil to the rest of us, to whom such things are better than a feast. But no, after covering themselves with infamy, these rakes contrive to steal the rewards that are the due of honest men. In defiance of all justice, these foul vices of luxury and sloth are no hindrance to them in their careers. It is the innocent and the state that suffers ruin. You can feel the anger rising from the crowd, that look in their eyes that shows that they have begun to see your light. The spell has been broken. They are with you. You have them. And if you wish, you could direct that anger into a riot. You know you can wield this crowd like a weapon and send them on a spree of murder directed at the villas of the nobility. The power is intoxicating, but that is not your purpose. So you continue your speech in a more soothing tone. Citizens, having said enough on that subject to defend my own character, though much less than their crimes deserve, I shall speak briefly of public affairs. In the first place, Numidia need cause you no anxiety. Hitherto, Jugurtha has been saved from defeat by the greed, incompetence, or vanity of your generals. But you have now changed all this. Moreover, you have legionaries there who know the terrain, though their success has been not equal to their valiant efforts, for it has been gravely weakened by the corruption or rashness of its leaders. I call, therefore, for all men of military age to rally to me in service of the Republic, and no one need fear a repetition of the misfortunes which your comrades suffered under my arrogant predecessors. I shall be with you, on the march, on the field of battle, to be your guide and share your perils, and I shall claim no special privileges for myself. Rest assured, with the help of our gods, all fruits of battle are ready to be plucked. Victory, spoils, and glory await you. Though even if these rewards were in doubt, it would still be your duty to aid your fatherland in its hour of need. Cowardice will not enable a man to live forever, and no parent ever prayed that their child might have immortality, but rather that they live virtuous and honorable lives. There is more I could say if faint hearts could have courage put into them by words. For the brave, I think I have said enough. You throw back your head and raise your arms to the sky. The silence lasts but seconds as the crowd roars, "Marius! Marius! Marius!" The rallying cry spreads out from the Forum, through the packed streets, and soon the city shakes with your name. You see the circling eagle begin to fly east towards Mount Olympus to tell Jupiter Optimus Maximus that his chosen is ready to fulfill his destiny. Let the thunderous roar of the people of ancient Rome to subside. Allow the image of the glorious eagle soaring across the sky to simply fade away. Come back to deep into history and hear me say, "This is the tale of a warrior who was risen to become consul of Rome. The tale of a nobleman risen from poverty causing scandal wherever he went. A consul's first command, a quaestor's first war. The saga of Jupiter's chosen and Nicopolis's Felix, and how their fates would forever be entwined by their actions in the war against the heir of Massinissa. Prepare to witness the deeds that would form the basis of a lifelong hatred that would bring the Republic to its knees and doom it to fall to the Empire. The epic tale of Marius versus Sulla. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly, put some smoke in the air if you choose, and let your mind float on my voice as we go deep into the 2nd century before the Common Era and experience the end of the brutal Jugurthine War. Versus the Eagles of Jupiter. Welcome back. While Gaius Marius marshaled his new recruits into legions on the field of the war god outside the walls of Rome, word arrived in Numidia that the now former consul Metellus had lost his imperium, his right to command legions in the war against Jugurtha. Furious and enraged at the loss of his status and the blow to his reputation in Rome delivered by Marius, he ordered the legions of Africa to disband, take their spoils, and sail for home. More than half of the 30,000 legionaries disobeyed, wishing to stay and fight for their comrade, the new consul, the man who had saved their lives more than once on the battlefield. However, many were forced to leave as they were clients of the Caeceli Metelli clan, though many of them wished to finish the war. Others were the nobles, the officers of the army, who had no wish to serve under this up-jumped equestrian, even though they knew Marius was the greatest warrior of his generation, a hero of the Republic. This broke the legions apart and robbed the forces that refused to leave of experienced and very competent commanders. Metellus, thinking that he had crippled Marius' chances for victory, gathered his share of the spoils and rode for the coast. He was so angry that he would not even meet Marius to formally hand over command of the African legions as tradition dictated, but instead sent a junior officer. He took ship and sailed for Italy with a badly bruised ego and fear for the damage Marius and the plebs had done to his reputation and the power of his family. When Marius's fleet arrived at the glorious port city of Utica, the consul learned that the African legions were in shambles. He considered the situation. He had 18,000 plebeian legionaries from Rome, untested and only barely trained. The remnant of the African legions were all crack veterans of the highest quality, men he knew and had fought with, bled with. He realized that this situation was perfect, though it would cost him time. He could remake the 3 legions in his own image, for a lifetime of warfare had given him a few notions and many insights on how to improve the Roman way of making war. He would mix the veterans with fresh recruits and subject them to drills and training he would oversee every detail of, and turn the legions into instruments of his will. On our next episode, the Versus tie-in, Reforma, I will go into depth on how Marius trains his legions, which led to the Marian reforms that would drastically change them, turning every legion into a disciplined killing machine, and carve his image on Rome's chief instrument of virtus forevermore. For now, I'll focus on the way he led in his first supreme command, and as a warrior driven by the prophecy of the Sibyl, who believed in it with every fiber of his being and was becoming consumed by it. If he were to attain the exalted rank 6 more times, a feat only made possible in his mind because he had heard Jupiter declare it, then he must make his first consulship legendary. Once he had reorganized the 3 legions along with their companion alas, he had roughly 14,000 Roman legionaries, 5,000 light infantry, and 10,000 ranged support units, mainly archers, slingers, siege engineers, and artillery specialists. He would need the huge number of ranged units because of the Numidian hit-and-run tactics, and the fact that he was dangerously low on cavalry. The war with Jugurtha had been murderous on the horses and riders of the cavalry, so much so that after the Battle of the Muthul River that we experienced in the first episode of Versus, Metellus' legions had been effectively without it for weeks, and even once reinforced, with the war having gone on for over a decade, Roman Africa was completely stripped of horses. This, coupled with a severe need of cavalry to face a barbarian horde north of the Alps, had robbed Rome of one of its most vital components for its legions. Knowing this, well before leaving Rome, Marius had reached out to his client network and secured around 700 horses suitable for combat, and sailed them with his army to Africa. He first assigned his newly elected officers to their commands, and because they were far from enough, he promoted worthy legionaries he served with and knew to fill and bolster the lesser command positions. When he felt his army was ready, he marched them into enemy territory. The results of the first few months of the war were frustrating for Consul Marius. Unable to provoke Jugurtha to commit his forces in a pitched battle, he found himself in the same position Metellus had been in. Towns fell, others revolted against Roman rule and had to be retaken. Spoils for the men of the legions were few and far between, and some of his men began to grumble. But then a thought occurred to Marius. But in order to understand the magnitude of it, let's take a quick trip back into the very distant past, where myth and history become one. Ready? Then let's go. According to African legend, far back in the mists of time, Hercules was not born in Greece. Though his father was Jupiter, Greek Zeus, the lord of Olympus, his mother Alcmene was a mortal. Fearing the wrath of Hera, Juno to the Romans, his wife, for his infidelity and worse for fathering a child, Alcmene was guided to the coasts of ancient Hellas, Greece, by eagles. There she was met by Poseidon, Roman Neptune, and doing a favor for his brother, spirited Alcmene across the Mediterranean to Africa on the back of a dolphin. Far enough away from Hera's gaze on her lofty perch atop Mount Olympus, so that she could bear her child without the goddess ever knowing. Once on the coast, she was told to walk inland and keep walking in a straight line by Neptune. She soon came to a desert. Desperate and with no choice, she walked onto the huge sand dunes. For days she kept walking, the burden of the child in her womb becoming harder with each step as there was no water to be had. Finally, on the 6th day, she topped a dune and collapsed, utterly exhausted. Yet had she been able to keep her eyes open for a mere second longer, Alcmene would have seen the tiny village of Capsa, built around a desert oasis. By the will of Jupiter, the villagers discovered her and brought her into one of their dwellings, and there she gave birth to her son, Heracles. Yet all was not well, for on Olympus Hera had noticed her husband's gaze on a faraway land, and she soon learned of the child. She became further enraged because the meaning of his name was the glorious gift of Hera. Thus she decided to give a gift of her own to the child. She used her godly powers to summon 2 huge serpents of that land, and sent them to strangle the babe while he slept. Yet this was no ordinary baby. He was a demigod, and when the serpents entered his crib, it was Heracles who strangled them with his tiny hands. The babe grew into a boy and was a joy and wonder to all the people of the village, lifting huge stones with ease for them and bringing them from miles away so that they could construct a town. Yet his fate forced him to leave. Years later, when the deeds of mighty Hercules became famous across the world, the villagers erected a shrine on the place of his birth. This soon attracted visitors from all over Africa, and many chose to remain and devote their lives to the worship of the demigod. It is even said that repenting the deeds of their species, the serpents of the desert that surround Capsa dedicated their lives and the lives of all their coming generations to protect the sacred ground and the town that surrounded it. By 107 BCE, Capsa had grown into a powerful town in southeast Numidia, surrounded by deserts, with the only source of water for miles being an inexhaustible spring in the center of the town, next to the temple of Heracles. The people of Capsa worshipped Heracles to the exclusion of all other gods, and strove to emulate their god in every way. They were a martial society, and through prayer, lifelong training, and devotion produced soldiers that in the Far East would have been called warrior monks, lethal with club, spear, and shield. In addition, the walls of Capsa were tall, thick, and strong. The sand dunes around the town swarmed with lethal vipers. Marius had learned of the existence of Capsa from Jugurtha himself during their time together when they served in the Numantine War. Jugurtha had spoken of the prowess in battle of its people. Once he had become king, he exempted the town from taxation, and in turn, the thousands of warrior monks were always his to call upon. They were now the backbone of his war effort. Taking the town would deal a crippling blow to Jugurtha. Marius also needed to outdo the deeds of Metellus in his taking of the fortress of scholars at Thala, because it was at that moment that Marius learned that upon his arrival in Rome, instead of being humiliated, his powerful clan, the Caecilii Metelli, had used its vast network of clients to fill the streets with cheering crowds. They had bribed the Senate into granting Metellus a triumph, and though the war was far from over, award him the name Numidicus, the greatest honor of all, a conqueror of the Republic. Marius knew it was a hollow title, though by outright buying the honor in the eyes of the people, Metellus had shown his power, and some plebs who had voted for Marius were in awe and flocked to become his clients. Instead of the powerful noble family being diminished, they had come out more powerful than ever before, and the optimates were overjoyed. Marius needed to generate an eclipse, an accomplishment that would remind his clients and the people who their champion was, and send a shockwave through the streets of Rome that would rock the 7 hills. The name Capsa kept running through his mind. So far, he had taken many towns and minor fortresses. He had even achieved justice by tracking down some of the legionaries who had defected to Jugurtha when he had surrounded the army of the hopelessly incompetent failson Aulus Posthumus Albinus and had them executed, which at any other time would be wildly popular as a boon to the virtus of the Republic. Yet none of this mattered back in Rome. To once again capture the hearts and imaginations of the people, he would need to achieve something epic. A victory in a final confrontation with Jugurtha would be ideal, but the wily king would not commit his forces, and was instead launching sporadic guerrilla attacks and then disappearing into the wilderness. Capsa. The consul considered. Should he risk it all in one epic roll of the dice? The feat was considered impossible. Taking a fortified town, held by a fanatically loyal and well-armed population, in the middle of a desert, with no water to be found anywhere, would make a conventional siege impossible. There had to be a way. From the battlements of his fortified camp, Marius looked out at the tens of thousands of cattle taken from nomads loyal to Jugurtha over the course of the entire campaign season. The herd filled the horizon and continued for many miles. Then it came to him, the beginnings of a plan. He summoned his officers to his command tent, knowing full well that the movements of his legions would be watched by Jugurtha's spies out in the plains. He ordered his praetor, Aulus Manlius, to take all the auxiliaries and march with the legion's wealth to a town they had recently secured for Rome. This caravan would contain all the denarii to pay the legions, as well as the accumulated spoils from the entire year of the war. A fortune large enough that every spy would not be able to help but follow it, for it would look lightly defended. However, Marius knew that his auxiliary alas were the greatest since Jugurtha himself had escorted the legion of Scipio Aemilianus at Numantia, drilled to perfection and battle-hardened. Led by the praetor, they would be formidable, if not unbeatable, yet look oh so tempting a target to the warbands that Jugurtha had scattered across the countryside. All eyes would be upon them, and the legion's wealth. And Marius was confident that if the Numidians communicated and gathered a force large enough to attack so many, their last moments on this plane of existence would be facing the companion alas of Gaius Marius, with the Ajax of the late Republic delivering justice with his massive gladius right beside his men. He was sure the legion's treasure would make it to safety behind the walls of the town. When the auxiliary column had departed, Marius began his plan to decimate Capsa. He turned his heavy cavalry into makeshift cattle wranglers, killers to cowboys. They drove the herd of tens of thousands of cattle ahead of the marching legions. Each day they would send 6 cattle per maniple, a group of 120 legionaries, where they were slaughtered and their skins sewn into water sacks and piled to dry on carts. This had a bonus effect of raising morale greatly, as the men could supplement their daily bread rations with a veritable Brazilian steakhouse of different cuts of beef. Most of these plebs had never eaten so well in their lives, and they loved their consul for it, and were more than willing to follow him to Hades and back, which was precisely what he was asking them to do. Capsa. It was on the 6th day of the march that they reached the river Tana, beyond which lay a seemingly endless desert. Marius ordered his legionaries to fill and carry 4 water skins each as their entire ration for the duration of the attack, for there would be absolutely no water unless they took Capsa. Marius had consulted the latest maps and had found the shortest possible path. The march would take 3 days across the scorching sands. They departed at night, driving a herd of approximately 20,000 cattle before them. During the days they made camp to escape the heat and marched at full speed at night. So it was that on the dawn of the 4th day, the citizens of Capsa woke to a wondrous and truly strange sight. They threw open their gates and were in complete disbelief that 2 miles away, the horizon was filled with cattle. Surely a gift from Heracles, they must have thought. The cattle could not survive the desert for long and would all have to be slaughtered, which meant enough dried beef to feed them for years and skins enough for the entire city to profit. Their priests and warriors were eager to make such an offering to Heracles in the form of the mass sacrifice they were about to commit. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds, and finally thousands of citizens poured out through the gate and were running to secure the herd. Many citizens and nearly all of their warriors were soon a mile away from their one and only city gate, the sanctuary of their walls, and the spring of Heracles, the only source of water for 3 long days. 2 miles to the southeast of the cattle, but much closer to the walls, hidden beyond a small sea of large sand dunes, were the legions. Marius on his stallion, his cattle wranglers now in formation around him, he gave the order, and with no horns blown, his 500 killers charged for the gate, the legions following behind in formation at a jog. The chargers devoured the distance to the gate and easily took it before the remaining guards could raise an alarm, so distracted were they by the spectacle. Out on the desert plain at the herd, the warriors of Capsa looked back at their city, their profound joy at the unexpected bounty suddenly turned into cold dread, as they saw the battle at the gate and the 3 legions quickly making their way to the city. In desperation, they began to run back to aid the guards and protect their families, but it was too late. Marius had sprung his trap. He let the 1st Legion in the formation pass through the gate with orders to take the city. The other two formed a battle line in front of the walls to receive the imminent charge of the thousands of men of Capsa who would soon be upon them. The council announced, "No prisoners," and the order was shouted from tribune to centurion to the legions, who indicated they understood by raising their first pilum to hurl at the enemy. The first volley launched when the desperate enemy was 20 feet away, immediately followed by a second. The men of Capsa were not equipped for battle, most having run out of the city in their street clothes, no shields, no armor, and most without weapons beyond the daggers they all carried. It was a slaughter. In desperation to reach their families, those who survived the two volleys threw themselves at the legions, only to be met with bone-cracking punches from the metal bosses of legionary scutums, the rounded rectangular shields, and while dazed and in shock from the blow, they were run through by gladiuses. In addition to the plight of their families in the town, they knew the only source of water for days was within their walls, which meant certain death if they could not break through to their homes. Thus the fighting was savage, and they fought until the last man fell dead. Then Marius rewarded his men by allowing them free rein to sack and pillage Capsa and keep all the spoils for themselves, so long as every citizen was put to the sword. The sack of Capsa was an act of utter brutality. As soon as this was accomplished, Marius dispatched riders to the coast to take word of this to Rome. He had taken Capsa, a stronghold out of legend, without losing a single legionary. When his messengers reached Rome, they went straight to his clients, many of them lesser Patronus, and their clients. The expanded network of tens of thousands spread the word that the Republic had a sacker of cities once again. A new Scipio Aemilianus had been found. That oh so rare a combination, as great a general as he was a warrior. And after years of troubling tales of bloodthirsty barbarian hordes on the northern frontier, where the legions sent to repel the invaders had disappeared to the last man, fear had begun to rule the streets of Rome. And now the Republic had a hero to rally around, and this flame of hope that they need not fear because they had Marius began to spread across the Roman world. Gaius Marius, in their eyes, was invincible. His popularity soared and eclipsed all others. After the money and favors called in, the strings that had been pulled by the Caecilian Metilli to grant Metellus a triumph and be given the name Numidicus, and the fact that the people were no longer speaking his name was a tremendous blow and a huge loss of face for his hated enemies. Word spread from city to city in Italy, and soon across all the provinces, and not long after, Julia Maria, his beloved wife, who was looking after their family's interests, acting as patrona, received rich visitors from across the world begging the honor of becoming their clients and joining his faction in the power structure of the Republic. Populare to the core, the Marians. His already vast client network exploded out of Rome and spread across the cities, from the Pillars of Hercules to the borders of the Asiatic kingdoms in the east. From messages sent home from legionaries, their families learned that Marius was keeping his promise and making them rich with spoils. At war's end, they would indeed be granted rich lands in Africa to farm, expand, and create a legacy for their children. Speas, hope, but not the toxic false hope that so many politicians had instilled in them before. Tangible, real. The reaction in Numidia was equally dramatic, particularly among the towns still loyal to King Jugurtha. With the fall of Capsa, who many considered the warrior heartland of their people, along with the horrific extermination of its population, they no longer wished to resist. The war had gone on for years, and it seemed that the very fabric of their culture was doomed if they did not capitulate. They had already endured the loss of Thala, their religious and spiritual center, now Capsa. To most Numidians, Jugurtha's inability to protect his kingdom meant that he was no king at all. Some towns sent delegations to Marius pledging their loyalty to Rome. Many more pledged that they would remain neutral and no longer aid or listen to the commands of Jugurtha. Marius received these envoys gracefully, but demanded intelligence and information as the condition of their neutrality. He needed to end the war quickly, as he had promised during his campaign for consul. As long as Jugurtha remained at large on the plains and in the wilderness with a core group of loyal supporters, there would never be peace. It was from this intelligence that he learned of the vaults near the river Molucca on the western edge of the kingdom and the border between Mauritania and Numidia. It was a fortress designed with one purpose in mind: to protect the vast bulk of Jugurtha's treasury. If Marius could seize that hoard of gold, it would cripple Jugurtha's ability to make war permanently. It was late in the campaign season, so Marius wintered his legions in the conquered towns, consulted maps, and planned his attack on the vault at Molucca. In the early spring of 106 BCE, the legions set out deep into the Numidian hinterland. Thus far, the war had raged largely in the east, where all the cities and towns of any significance were. They entered the vast plains and deserts that were the realms of the nomads, Jugurtha's most loyal remaining followers. The legions were still without any light cavalry, making the army at march vulnerable to the quick hit-and-run tactics of the Numidians. For cover fire, they would have to rely on their ranged units alone. However, the intelligence he had received all winter had placed Jugurtha very far to the south. For all intents and purposes, he had vanished. Without their king to coordinate them, the nomads may well not attack at all. Marius didn't take any chances. He kept his scouts out in force, seeking out possible ambush sites, and kept his personal bodyguard of 500 heavy cavalry with the legions on the march. His legionaries were trained and instructed to meet any attacks from the ranged Numidian horsemen with locked and raised shields and a volley of their pilum. This served them well, for the legions were attacked, though by small bands, and suffered little, as each one was easily repulsed. After the march of over 100 miles was complete, Marius beheld the vault at Molucca. It was a devilishly contrived rectangle of death, rising from a flat plain, built upon a monolith whose sides had been chiseled into sheer cliffs. The walls rose where the stone ended. There was only one huge wooden gate into the vault, and to reach it, the attackers would have to walk up a long and narrow causeway that led to a square plateau large enough to hold no more than a few thousand men at a time. Atop the walls were defenders with ranged weapons of every kind, ranging from archers, Roman-style scorpions, and huge siege ballista. All of the 4,000 occupants were warriors and well supplied to resist the siege for many months. Designed by Jugurtha himself, this mini Suthul had only one purpose: to destroy any army foolish enough to try and seize his gold. After riding around the vault, Marius realized that encircling it with siege lines would be pointless, as the walls were so high, an extension of the natural sheer rock, that no assault could be made, and it was highly doubtful anyone could be lowered down to be sent to call Jugurtha's army to aid them. However, again, this was a calculated risk, because Marius wanted Jugurtha to come and face his legions in a pitched battle and be utterly defeated, and end the war in a heroic fashion, the Roman way, vanquishing a hated enemy on the battlefield, keeping his promise, and killing him, or better yet, capturing him, and bringing Jugurtha to Roman chains to march in his triumph. Virtus. Thus Marius set one long siege line at the foot of the causeway that led to the only gate, and it ran the length of that side of the vault. He understood that the fortress could only be taken by storm, and it would be a bloody affair. It would cost many of his men their lives. With his siege line set, Marius made a probing assault up the causeway, covered by a barrage of Roman artillery in the form of catapults and siege ballista, firing from their siege line. His men marched behind mantlets. Large mounted shields rolled up the narrow causeway ramp. The defenders on the walls of the vault waited for the legionaries to reach the midway point, and then the scorpions twanged and their archers let loose, and the first maniples took horrendous losses. Those not hit by arrows or bolts were pushed off the sides by the crush on the causeway, only to fall screaming to their deaths 50 feet below. Marius immediately ordered a halt to the attack and recalled his forces. Over the coming days, he ordered a few more probing attacks, changing the angles of his siege weapon and concentrating their fire on the enemy scorpions, but to no avail. Each time the legions retreated, the defenders would laugh and hurl insults at the Romans, telling them that they would all be made slaves when King Jugurtha arrived with his army. The vault was impregnable, impossible to assault directly, so the legions settled in their siege line, fortified their camp, and resolved to starve the defenders out. The coming months passed slowly. It was during this time the quaestor Marius had left behind on the Campus Martius to gather and train the light auxiliary cavalry that arrived from across Italy, a man whose personality he would come to know intimately, to the regret of all. The gladius of the Subura and his lancers had ridden across the war zone that was recently conquered Numidia, all the way from the glorious port city of Utica in Roman Africa, careful to avoid ambushes and setting ones of their own when small bands of enemies were spotted. When Lucius Cornelius Sulla entered the command tent, he dropped the heads of 9 of Jugurtha's spies, ambassadors, and infiltrators at Marius's feet, and then proceeded to give a detailed account of their journey and reported on enemy movements. Consul Marius was impressed by the man he had first written off as a spoiled optimate, doubly so when he saw the loyalty and devotion he had inspired in his lancers. With a powerful force of light cavalry for the first time, they were able to conduct reconnaissance in force without fear of ambush. The fog of war around the siege line was lifted for Marius. And unable to get any scouts near enough, the vault in effect vanished for Jugurtha. Still, the formidable defenses had Marius confounded. If the siege lasted much longer, he would be forced to raise it in order to reach a well-supplied friendly city to survive the coming winter. There was just no way to take it. And when news of this reached Rome, his enemies would use his failure to ruin his reputation as the Achilles of the late Republic and permanently destroy his aura of invincibility in battle. But then, as if by the will of Jupiter, something truly strange occurred. At one extreme of the rectangular siege camp that ran the length of the front of the vault, there was an auxiliary spearman, a Ligurian lad from an allied Italian town, who was staring fixedly on a rocky outcrop at the edge of the cliff, on top of which the intersecting walls met on that corner, because on that rocky outcrop was a huge African rock snail, its shell an onyx cornucopia glittering in the sunlight, and home to the most succulent snail the young auxiliary had ever seen. You see, Ligurians weren't big on eating beef. Cattle was expensive to raise, and their towns were not near suitable land on which to raise them. Thus he had taken no delight in the consul's gift of steak during the assault on Capsa, and the dried salted beef they still dined on. But there is something you should know about Ligurians. They were connoisseurs of snails, of which the gods had given them plenty in the rocky hills surrounding their towns. To the lad looking out across the no-man's land, that perfect snail was a gift from Jupiter himself. It called to him, taunted him, tormented him. And since it was now halfway up the ilex tree that grew halfway up the cliff against the rock, it would soon be out of his reach forever. So he risked legionary punishment for deserting the siege line at the hands of the Chief Justice and his direct commander, the giant praetor Aulus Manlius, and as if possessed, he moved. He first scaled the Roman palisade, dropped down from the walls of the camp, and sprinted across to the rocks without being seen miraculously. Wasting no time, he climbed straight up the tree to catch the huge snail. Once covered by the foliage of the upper branches, he took a breath and searched. Yet there was no sight of it. He climbed higher and found that the tree concealed a narrow crevice halfway up the cliff. He climbed into it, and once clear of the tree, he saw that he was on a natural path worn into the rocks. Using his skills, the Ligurian expertly climbed up the steep and winding trail until he was directly under the walls, and to his surprise he found there were no guards patrolling it. Since the siege had gone on for months, with the Romans only having one way of attack, the Numidians guarding the vault had grown complacent, only manning the front of their walls, leaving the gate open and assembling outside on the plateau, taunting the Romans. The Ligurian lad had found a deadly fault in the vault, so he quickly turned and made his descent to inform the consul. Unfortunately, the fate of the African rock snail is lost to history. As it turned out, that information would save his life because his absence had been noticed, and he was met by his centurion with a punishment detachment and brought before the praetor for judgment. Aulus Manlius heard the excited Ligurian out, and he took him to the consul. Marius heard the tale of the snail and asked for detailed descriptions of the terrain and the height of the walls and their construction up close. The lad was at something of a loss for the amount of detailed information Marius required, so the consul ordered Manlius to find out if this was all true and take note of every detail. When the praetor returned, filthy from squeezing his massive bulk through the narrow pass, but with a grim smile on his face, he and the consul planned the destruction of the vault at Molucca. Marius ordered 2 colossal assault towers to be constructed, configured exactly to his specifications. He then found the most agile and lithe amongst his soldiers, many of them Ligurian auxiliaries, along with 4 centurions, and because he begged the honor to lead the assault, placed the praetor in command of a force of 320 to be the team that would lead the heist of the vault. They left their Roman armor and weapons behind. Instead, every man was dressed in the garb of a Numidian warrior and equipped with captured tribal shields and spears. The rest of the legions were ordered to prepare for a full-scale assault. It speaks volumes for the legionnaires' engineering skill and discipline that the colossal assault towers were raised in mere days. These rolling multi-storied engines had a wide base, with each level above connected by a staircase. The frames and interiors were constructed of wood, and the outer shells with layers of first leather hides and then slabs of metal to resist incoming fire from the siege ballista on the walls. Typically, they were rolled up to city walls, and a ramp would drop down from the top level, allowing legionaries to climb up and storm the palisades. Though in this case, Marius had something entirely else in mind. The heist of the vault at Molucca unfolded thusly. The legions were ordered to form testudos, the tortoise formation, a rectangle of shields covering front, sides, and overhead, and ascend the narrow causeway. On either side of them, an assault tower was pushed up with the forward elements. Sulla and his lancers, along with the legionary scouts, were out in force in the surrounding countryside, patrolling every inch, for were Jugurtha to arrive with an army while the assault was underway, he could trap the legions between the walls and their camp and annihilate them. Meanwhile, under cover of the pre-dawn darkness, the praetor and his infiltration unit moved towards the ilex tree, climbed it, and into the narrow path. Since he was most familiar with the terrain, the Ligurian lad who had chased the enchanted snail led the way. When they came to steep, difficult parts, he would ascend and then descend, showing the men behind where to place their hands and feet. They made it to the top of the difficult path and once again found the walls unguarded. They gathered under the walls and waited for the signal. At the break of dawn, before the walls of the vault at Molucca, the snaking line of Roman testudos were already halfway up the causeway. At the end of the causeway, on the plateau, most of the enemy garrison was outside the gate, looking and laughing with sadistic glee at the foolish Romans who would surely be repulsed with great loss once they came within range of the archers and artillery on their walls. Many of the Numidians calling out challenges to single combat, wishing to test their skill against the Romans. At that moment, Consul Marius, observing the battle from his command tower, gave the order, and dozens of catapults and huge siege ballista were rolled out from concealment behind the walls of the siege lines. Every piece of artillery the legions had, and they fired at will on the defenders atop the walls. The thunderous impact of siege bolts and boulders and the screams of dying men was unmistakable. The signal was given, and every enemy in the vault's attention was drawn to the front. The infiltration team threw up hooked ropes and climbed the walls to the palisades, the first up securing and dropping roped ladders down so that the others could easily make the climb. Because of their disguises, to any of the Numidians under fire on the front walls who happened to look back, they would have appeared as a reserve unit or reinforcements at first glance. Once the infiltrators were assembled atop the wall, half calmly marched off the palisade and towards the inside of the main gate, while the others held their position, guarding the escape route in case the plan failed. In front, the legions were nearing the wide top of the causeway, where the army of Numidians were now lined up in battle order, eager to face what legionaries survived the barrage from their walls that was surely about to begin. For as yet, the Numidian artillery had been focused on bringing down the siege towers, to no avail. They were far too heavily armored. And it was at this precise moment that the assault towers showed their true purpose. Instead of the typical glorified armored staircase with a few levels of artillery, Marius had each level of his towers packed with scorpions, vicious bolt throwers that could penetrate multiple men packed tightly together. In the gaps between were his best archers. Metal slits opened. The towers unleashed their fire not on the defenders on the wall, but instead on the packed ranks of the garrison on the plateau. The fire was withering, and the Numidians were ordered to retreat behind their walls. However, when the first elements turned and were about to re-enter the vault, the gate swung shut and was closed before their eyes. The infiltrators had taken the gates, and seeing this, the other half that had been guarding their escape route now attacked the unsuspecting defenders on the walls nearest them from behind. On the plateau, the now locked out defenders, under constant fire, found themselves face to face with the legions, who would use the time and space provided on the plateau to form a shortened battle line and advance on them. By the time the attackers realized what was happening, they were trapped between their walls and the Roman wall of shields. They were destroyed to the last man. Then the gates were flung open, and the legions took their vengeance for the months of insults that the Numidians had hurled at them. Not a single defender survived the assault, and when the consul entered the central building, the vault itself, he found Jugurtha's treasury, an ocean of gold so vast as to defy belief. And thus, because of this strange sequence of events, Gaius Marius won a huge victory from what looked like would have been an inglorious and embarrassing defeat. Knowing that Jugurtha would have to try to take back his treasure, the legions immediately prepared for the long march back to Cirta, Sanctuary. We experienced their perilous journey that culminated in the epic Second Battle of Cirta in verses Origins, so seductive. And speaking of so seductive, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Nicopolis' Felix, takes the lead in our tale after this. If you've been listening to this episode for the last hour, I know you're enjoying it. I also know that I enjoy creating them for you and could really use your help to keep Deep Into History independent and thriving. Go to patreon.com/deepintohistory and pledge your support. It's just 10 cents a day, and you'll get to experience the first crossover episode of Verses. You see, while Rome sent its best warriors to wage war in Africa, a threat came from the far north. It all began as tales of untold numbers of barbarians appearing at the edge of the known world and devouring all the small tribes in their path. A lone blood-drenched German warrior made his way to the far south to a legionary outpost on the frontier. Yet just as he arrived, he succumbed to his wounds, whispering about witches performing mass human sacrifices and bathing in blood. Rome sent scouts to investigate, and none of them returned. Legions were dispatched only to disappear as if they had never existed, for Rome had no idea of the sheer number and warrior prowess of the Cimbri and the Teutons. Join me for a journey in the dark forest beyond the Alps and experience a series of strange events that led to Rome's worst defeat since the Republic was brought to its knees by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. Bloodthirsty witches, a sea of barbarians, a stolen treasure that belonged to a denizen of Olympus, a Roman's greed, all leading to the catastrophic Battle of Arausio and a tale I call
The Curse of Apollo's Gold, coming soon, only on Patreon. Now back to the Eagles of Jupiter. Recall that after the titanic Second Battle of Cirta, that poets call the Knights of the Bandits, Quaestor Lucius Cornelius Sulla, commander of the legion's light cavalry, his lancers, was hailed as the greatest warrior in the legions of Gaius Marius, and Consul Marius liked this not at all. He was used to being the center of attention, and it bothered him to have the younger, far more handsome, and extraordinarily gifted Optimate being cheered and praised and talked about everywhere in their winter sanctuary, the city of Cirta. 3 days had passed since the epic victory, Jugurtha's army crushed, and the king's ocean of gold, now Marius's, when unexpectedly secret envoys arrived from King Bocchus of Mauritania, asking Marius to send envoys to his palace at the capital city of Volubilis. They asked Marius to ensure that the men he sent were of great discretion, as secrecy was of the utmost importance. Wishing to have the new hero of the legions, Sulla, out of his sight, he dispatched him with the praetor Aulus Manlius in overall command. Yet by the time they reached the capital of Mauritania, Sulla had wowed the giant praetor with his knowledge and eloquence to such a degree that once in the presence of the king, he let the quaestor speak for Rome. We heard Sulla's words last episode, but in essence he told the king that he had been a naughty boy, and that there was every advantage in the world to being allied with Rome, and every disadvantage if he continued to support Jugurtha. After all, Sulla and his lancers had delivered this object lesson on the battlefield to the king's royal guard. His speech, delivered with his usual flair and charm, put King Bocchus on the defensive about his conduct thus far. The king said that having the legion stationed for months on the literal border between Numidia and Mauritania at the river Molucca had been a sign of Roman aggression. How was he to know that the legions would not come for his kingdom next? He maintained that he was acting in self-defense and out of familial obligation to his in-law, King Jugurtha. However, he wished for peace, and if Sulla agreed, he would send an embassy to Marius to conclude it. Sulla consented, and he and the praetor left for Cirta to inform the consul of all that had transpired. Yet when they arrived, they found the consul gone. Marius had learned the location of that most wretched of creatures to Roman virtus, traitors. Recall the legions of Aulus Posthumus Albinus, the spoiled, incompetent fail-son, who led his army in the doomed attack on the mighty fortress Suthul in 110 BCE that we experienced in the first part of our tale. Thousands of auxiliaries and at least part of one legion had betrayed their incompetent officers to Jugurtha after the embarrassing defeat. As reward, Jugurtha had given some of them a walled town and plenty of gold to live rich lives as his subjects. After the massive victory at Second Cirta, informants wishing to curry favor with the Romans began to come forward from all over Numidia. One of them betrayed the location of this town. Marius immediately ordered the location scouted, and after receiving a detailed description of the defenses, he marched on it, leading the auxiliary light infantry. The details of that attack are few. What we do know is that the town was taken during a daring night raid, with Marius leading it himself. Every one of the traitors was slain, and for this act of vengeance on behalf of the honor of all Romans, Marius's reputation reached the stratosphere when news of this reached Rome. Here I should note that there is another version of this event, that Marius failed in this mission because his scouts had been spotted and he found the town abandoned. This may be a counter-narrative put out by the Optimates to embarrass Marius, as the version originates in Rome itself. It is impossible for us to know for sure, unless more sources about this event are discovered. When the official peace envoys of King Bocchus arrived at Cirta, they were in a terrible state, for their party had been ambushed by bandits, who had killed their guards and then beaten and robbed the nobles. Unsure if these men could possibly be who they claimed to be, Quaestor Sulla was summoned to the gates, as he may be able to verify their claim, because in their sorry condition they looked like beggars. He immediately granted them entry to the city and took them to his quarters. He had their wounds tended to and had them bathed and fed. He then gave them gifts at his own expense of fine robes, jewelry like men of their station were accustomed to wearing, along with purses filled to near bursting with denarii. He made them feel completely at home and befriended all of them. They explained that they had full authority to negotiate peace on behalf of their king. Sulla instructed them on how to speak to the consul, how to convince him of their king's sincerity, knowing something of Marius's temperament. And because of this, when Marius returned from his raid, the envoys insisted that Sulla be involved in their discussions. It is these negotiations that give us true insight into how a consul conducted diplomacy while on campaign. After formally receiving the envoys, he sent for his senior officers, every person of senatorial rank, and the governor of Roman Africa, and once gathered, they all heard the peace proposal from King Bocchus. They then conferred with one another and decided to write a letter endorsing the proposed agreement to the Senate in Rome. This letter was dispatched with the envoys who took ship at the glorious port city of Utica. They left with the understanding that they would have to make King Bocchus' case to the entire Senate themselves and then present a letter of endorsement from a consul of Rome. Once the Senate voted and set the terms, Marius would enforce them. With this being the process, we can understand why peace agreements made by consuls, governors, or praetors that had been made under duress or when surrendering were not legally binding, which only makes sense in a society driven by virtus. Every diplomatic agreement had to maintain the honor of Rome at all times. In addition, before they left, Sulla spoke on behalf of King Bocchus to Marius and secured a truce for Mauritania for the duration of the negotiations. 3 of the envoys were sent to Rome to act as official ambassadors,
while the other two were sent back to Volubilis to inform the king on all that had transpired. And this is when he learned of the generous actions and friendship displayed by Quaestor Sulla. Once in Rome, the ambassadors were overawed at the city's sheer size and the multitude of peoples from around the Mediterranean world filling its streets. And as their mission was vital, they were conducted directly to the Senate floor. Looking up at the hundreds of senators on the tiered benches, garbed in the finest the rich republic had to offer, it would have appeared as if Rome was ruled by a council of hundreds of kings. The ambassadors made an impassioned plea, expressing their king's sorrow for his error at attacking the legions at the Second Battle of Cirta, claiming that King Bocchus had been led astray by the vile Jugurtha, and went on to solicit earnestly for friendship and peace between Rome and Mauritania. The Senate conferred briefly, and then instructed the ambassadors to take this reply back to their king. The Senate and people of Rome do not forget either services or injuries. However, since Bocchus repents of his wrongdoing, we are willing to pardon him. As to friendship and alliance, he shall have these when he has earned them. Immediately after, the ambassadors were escorted out of the city and put on a ship bound for Mauritania at the nearby port of Ostia. When they arrived at the palace at Volubilis, King Bocchus was happy with the result and sent a letter to Marius asking that he send Sulla to his court to represent the consul and to further the bond of friendship between their peoples. Marius agreed and once again decided to send the praetor Aulus Manlius with him to keep an eye on the wildly popular quaestor. As the distance they would be required to travel through the Numidian hinterland was still a war zone, with the perils of bandits and Jugurtha severely weakened but still at large, they were to be sent with a small but powerful escort. The praetor assembled 500 of his best light infantry, a large contingent of slingers, and Sulla complemented the escort with perhaps 500 of his light lancers, with another dozen mounted scouts, and they marched. On the 5th day, the horizon was suddenly filled full of horsemen. Fearing an attack, the Romans formed up for battle, with the giant praetor at the center of the infantry, with the slingers right behind, and Sulla's horsemen in 2 groups on each flank. A scout soon returned with news that it was Volux, a son of King Bocchus, who had been dispatched with an honor guard of heavy cavalry to escort the Romans to the capital. What at a distance had appeared as a huge force was in fact no more than 1,000 riders that had been spread out to allow their horses to graze. When Prince Volux came forward, he addressed Sulla directly instead of the praetor because of the impression he had made at court, and because, unaware to Marius, the praetor had grown to allow Sulla to speak for them, as he was so eloquent. Thus the praetor took no offense at this breach in protocol. The 2 parties formed into one column, with Sulla riding with Volux, and quickly, as he tended to do, completely charmed the prince, so that he was hanging off his every word, and expertly questioned him to learn all he could of Mauritania and the goings-on at the royal court. The 2 soon became fast friends. Late the next evening, in camp, Volux came running up to Sulla with a look of terror on his face, and informed him that his scouts had spotted Jugurtha with a large force of riders not far away. The prince begged Sulla to escape with him under cover of darkness, leaving their men behind. Sulla said that he had no fear of the Numidian who they had beaten in battle so many times, that he had nothing but confidence in his men's valor, and that even if it meant certain death, he would stand and fight rather than betray his soldiers and disgrace himself by fleeing. So Volux insisted that the entire party leave together that night to put as much distance between them and Jugurtha's force as possible. Sulla agreed to this and ordered the Romans to quickly eat and light many campfires so it would appear that they were still there from a distance, and then in the darkness they moved out in silence. They marched throughout the night, and at dawn, with the men exhausted, they begun the process of measuring out their camp to construct before resting for the day. Yet soon after, a Mauritanian scout returned from a patrol with news that Jugurtha and his army of several thousand mercenaries was 2 miles ahead, camped across the only route through the hills to the border of Mauritania. Sulla and Manlius conferred, the praetor conveying that the men were terrified that this was a trap. Many were openly saying that Volux had betrayed them to Jugurtha. I say we kill them all and make our way back to Cirta. The consul must learn of this treachery. Sulla nodded his agreement, but said something to the effect that he needed to look into Prince Volux's eyes and learn the truth before they acted, but to have the men ready to draw their swords, to move when he moved, meaning that the signal to annihilate any hope of peace with Mauritania would be his gladius dripping with Volux's royal blood. In the space where the camp was to be built, the Roman escort squadron assembled in ranks as before. Sulla walked out in front of them and gave a short speech to allay their fears. His words: "Know that a handful of brave men have often fought successfully against a multitude, that the less anxious they were to save their lives in battle, the greater would be their security, and that no man who has arms in his hands ought to trust for safety to his unarmed heels, or turn to the enemy in however great danger the defenseless and blind parts of his body." This conveyed to the men that Sulla would fight with them to the end, and that to run was to die. With that said, they moved to confront Prince Volux. The approach of the disciplined Roman formation provoked alarm among the Mauritanians, and the nearby riders mounted to protect their prince. But instead the Romans came to a halt a few dozen paces away, and Sulla, in full battle armor, crested helm gleaming in the sun, his now storied long cavalry saber, a spatha hanging from his belt, approached alone. He stopped between the lines and pointed towards Mount Olympus in faraway Greece. And though he had no religious authority, he invoked Jupiter Optimus Maximus to witness the guilt and treachery of King Bocchus, claiming the ground as Roman soil, and ordered Volux and his men to quit the camp as they had led them into a trap. He named Volux his enemy. The prince approached Sulla alone, unarmed, tears flowing from his eyes down his face. He begged Sulla not to believe such a thing. He explained that this was all due to the cunning of Jugurtha, and that he surely must have used spies to discover their route. Volux's words: "Since Jugurtha has not a large force with him, and since his hopes of attaining men and supplies depend on my father, I do not believe he will attempt any open violence while I am here to witness it. So I think our best course is to march boldly right through his camp. As far as I'm concerned, my men can either be sent on in front or left here where they are. I'm prepared to go with you alone." Sulla looked into Volux's eyes as he considered the impassioned plea, their situation, and decided to believe the young prince. Sulla agreed and insisted that they move immediately so Jugurtha would be taken by surprise at the speed of their arrival. They did so, and when they passed through the enemy camp set astride the road, Jugurtha had no choice but to let them pass, as Volux was riding right next to Sulla at the head of the column. Jugurtha's stare shot daggers at the quaestor, and according to legend, it was met by one of the most arrogant smirks in all of human history, delivered by a man trained by the most famous actors and mimes in Rome. The tension was very high, yet they were allowed to pass unharmed and unhindered. There was a reason for this, for Jugurtha had a plan. He had sent a man named Aspar, his most loyal remaining follower, in advance of the Romans to the royal court at Volubilis to negotiate for him, and of course heavily bribe every advisor of King Bocchus to support his cause. Recall that Jugurtha had been bribing the royal court for years, and it paid off because it was these same advisors that convinced King Bocchus to join Jugurtha and fight the titanic Second Battle of Cirta. And by this point, Jugurtha had funneled almost all of his remaining gold into the royal court, so much so that it was saturated with his spies and his bought men. Nothing happened in Volubilis that he did not know about and to a large extent dictate, and because of this, he was confident that he could thwart any peace negotiations. The thing is that with his treasury taken by Marius, all his hopes depended on keeping Bocchus on his side to gain another Mauritanian army for one last battle to decide it all. When Sulla presented himself at court, he was met by a room full of these advisors, and he was told that the king needed time to fully consider his options and to return in 10 days. He was given a room for the night in the palace so that he could rest before returning to his party, which had made camp outside the city. In the middle of the night, the king sent for Sulla, and they met secretly, away from the eyes of Jugurtha's spies. Bocchus's words: "Never did I think that I, the greatest king in Africa, the greatest indeed so far as I know in the world, should find myself indebted to a private individual. I swear that before I knew you, Sulla, I gave assistance to many, either in response to their requests or of my own accord, without myself ever needing any man's help. Such a loss of independence is to most people an occasion of grief, but I rejoice in it. To have come at last in need of aid is the price that I have paid for your friendship, which I value more highly than anything else in the world. It is open to you to test my sincerity in this. Arms, men, gold, in a word, whatever I have that you desire are yours to take and use. And as long as you live, never think that my debt of gratitude to you is discharged. It is one that I feel I can never begin to repay, and no wish of yours, should I know of it, shall remain unsatisfied. For to my mind it is less shameful for a king to be vanquished by arms than be outdone in generosity. Now as to the Republic of Rome, whose interests you have come here to protect, here is what I have to say. I have not made war on the Roman people, nor have I at any time sought to involve them in war. I have only used war to defend my frontiers against armed invaders. I will do so no longer, since that is what your countrymen wish. Conduct your war against Jugurtha as you please. I will not cross the river Molucca, which was the boundary between Micipsa and myself, nor will I allow Jugurtha to retreat across it. If there is any further request that the Roman people can properly make of me, and that I can grant without loss of honor, it shall not be refused. Sulla considered the king's words. Bocchus had just declared that should Sulla broker an alliance, he would become a client, not of the Republic, but of Sulla himself. A single client so rich and powerful that with him alone, Sulla as Patronus would dwarf entire client networks of even the most elite optimates in Rome. Yet as the only representative of his consul, to make the alliance a reality, he had to guide Bocchus in such a way that would not insult him, but at the same time ensure that Roman virtus was satisfied. Thus he smiled and nodded his head in respect and friendship, and then made his face grim to reflect the seriousness of the situation. For rivers of blood had already flown between their peoples. Sulla explained that to satisfy the Senate and people of Rome's honor and prove himself a worthy ally, Bocchus could not just offer support and friendship. He would have to do something. Something that clearly benefited Rome far more than Mauretania. Sulla concluded his remarks with these words. In fact, you do not need to look very far. You can easily lay hands on Jugurtha. If you hand him over to Consul Marius, Rome will be greatly obliged to you. Friendship, alliance, the 1/3 of Numidia that Jugurtha promised you, all will be yours without lifting a finger. King Bocchus was stunned and refused at first, saying that his bonds of kinship through marriage, to say nothing of the treaty he had with Jugurtha, would make this impossible. King Bocchus went on to explain that Jugurtha was very popular among his people, and by breaking his sworn word through this treacherous act, coupled with the huge losses his army had suffered in battle, meant that the relatives of the fallen hated the Romans. Thus he could face revolts in his own kingdom, or even a full-scale civil war. Sulla explained that his concerns were all trivial if he had the backing of Consul Gaius Marius and the Republic of Rome. Their conversation lasted hours, but in the end Sulla convinced King Bocchus to betray Jugurtha, and the two planned the trap. The next day a messenger was dispatched to Jugurtha to tell him that King Bocchus had negotiated a peace with Rome that would allow Jugurtha to remain king of Numidia, the one thing he desired above all else. Jugurtha considered the message and decided that it was too good to be true. He knew the Romans well, and knew that Rome would never suffer him to live after all his transgressions and after being named an enemy of the Republic. Thus he replied that he wished nothing more than peace and would meet any demands the Romans made. However, he had made peace treaties with Roman generals during the course of the long war, all of which had been repudiated by the Senate. He deeply distrusted Marius's intentions. Jugurtha's words to the messenger. If Bocchus wants to serve the interests of us both by securing a treaty of peace that will be honored, let him arrange for the interested parties to attend a conference, ostensibly for the purpose of discussing terms, and there deliver Sulla into my hands. Once I have such an important man in my power, the Senate and people will soon conclude a formal treaty. For if so distinguished a man is taken prisoner through no fault of his own while bravely serving his country, they will never be content to leave him in captivity. From this statement, we can see that though Jugurtha had spent so much time among the Romans, he had never truly come to understand them. Virtus would demand not that they make peace for Sulla's return, but to redouble their efforts to destroy Jugurtha. King Bocchus's reply was to set the meeting 3 days hence. Contrary to the historical consensus, This was not a time of worry or trepidation for Sulla. He was a shrewd judge of character, had calculated the odds, considered the angles, and knew what would happen. On the appointed day, at a secluded hill near a sacred oasis, Jugurtha arrived to find King Bocchus standing with Sulla and a few guards. As a condition of the meeting, everyone was unarmed. Jugurtha had with him the last few Numidian noblemen who were still loyal to him as bodyguards, and when his party reached the top of the hill, he greeted the king as family. He must have known something was wrong when Bocchus would not look him in the eyes, but instead made a gesture with his hand. Arrows came flying out of the bushes, killing his retainers, and Jugurtha was seized by Bocchus's guards and forced to his knees before the wickedly grinning quaestor Sulla. Nearly as soon as Jugurtha's hands were bound, he was placed in a secure cage on a cart and taken to the Roman escort column secreted not far away. They then marched at best speed back to Cirta. Approximately 2 weeks later, as they neared the sanctuary city, a writer was dispatched to tell the consul of all that had transpired. Marius ordered his legions to arms and marched them across the massive gorge that was the only entrance into Cirta, and assembled them to receive the returning party, for he needed his legions to do something for him, and he knew they would once they received the earth-shattering news that they, the true legions of the people of Rome, the plebs, had won the 12-year-long and exceptionally brutal Jugurthine War, a feat that legions assembled and led by Optimates had never been able to achieve. Consul Gaius Marius, the child of prophecy, standing on a raised dais before his assembled legions in their gleaming armor, must have been an incredible sight as Quaestor Sulla and the praetor Aulus Manlius rode up at the head of their column. The praetor, being of senior rank, dismounted his stallion that looked like a pony while it carried his gigantic frame, and walked to a place directly in front of the consul, looking down on him from his prominent height. And in a booming voice, the Ajax of the late Republic informed his master that through aggressive negotiations, Quaestor Sulla had ended the war, and then he pointed behind him. Coming up the lane between the hundreds of arrayed maniples was a cart with a metal cage atop it. He roared that they had captured Jugurtha. Legionaries swiveled their heads and turned their eyes as much as they dared to catch a glimpse of their nemesis. And as the rolling cage came to a halt before the dais upon which Marius was standing, the consul turned to his legions and saluted them. In answer, his men cried out in unison, "Imperator! Imperator! Imperator!" The acclamation that tradition dictated had to come naturally from a conquering army to their general in order to qualify him for a triumph, the highest honor that any Roman could hope to achieve. Of course, there was still the matter of convincing the Senate, who largely despised this champion of the plebs, that they should grant him one. Marius left a portion of his legions, most of them veterans who wished to be granted lands in Africa, behind to garrison the major towns, while the Senate came up with a permanent settlement for a new government of Numidia, and sailed for Rome with the rest of his army. The journey took 10 days. After arriving at the port of Ostia, Marius led his legions in parade march to the limits of the city, and had them make camp on the field of the war god. Accompanied by his officers, they walked to the top of a small hill that marked the beginning of the Pomerium, a sanctified invisible boundary that surrounded the eternal city. Once crossed, any holder of high office would lose their imperium, meaning their right to command legions would be extinguished. As was tradition, Marius was expected to stand there with his officers while he dispatched a runner to the Senate and asked that a delegation be sent forth to hear a formal list of his accomplishments, the deeds of his men and officers, the tale of their victory, and give account of the loot and spoils taken during the campaign, and then beg for permission to cross the sacred Pomerium in triumph, which would allow him to lead his legions in parade through the city. Once they heard this, normally the delegation would then have to go back to the Senate, where the issue would be voted upon, and if passed, would then have to be ratified by the tribes of the plebeian assembly. Yet instead, Marius and his officers were greeted not only by a large number of senators, but the tribunes of the plebs. And before he spoke, they declared that his triumph had already been approved, and then news that must have shook him to the core of his being. He was told that in his absence, the Republic had suffered its worst defeat since the Battle of Cannae at the hands of Hannibal in the Second Punic War. Far beyond the Alps, a barbarian horde had destroyed a colossal Roman army at the Battle of Arausio, and that not just Rome, but all of Italy was in a state of panic and despair, fearing that the barbarians would invade south and soon be at the gates of the city. When the plebs heard that Marius had landed at Ostia, victorious, they received it as a sign from the gods. Only Gaius Marius, the Achilles of the late Republic, could save Rome. Public pressure grew so intense that even the nobles, the optimates, agreed. They named him consul by acclamation, an unprecedented act that the Senate had no choice but to ratify. We can only imagine the thoughts that were running through his mind at that moment. But we can be fairly certain that if he had any doubts about the prophecy he had received in the Sibyl's cave all those years ago, they were forever silenced. His fate was Jupiter's will, and he would attain the rank of consul, the pinnacle of power, 7 times, a defining moment in his life. Now I could just explain to you how a Roman triumph worked, and tell you about the most glorious triumph Rome had experienced since the fall of Carthage. But this is deep into history, and you are with your friend and lore master Arjun, so you know you are going to experience it. Prepare to become one with Jugurtha, and witness the triumph of Gaius Marius in 104 BC, because if you were to see it through Massinissa's grandson's eyes, it might have gone something like this. You are being led by a centurion holding a chain that connects the one that links the cuffs around your wrists to the one on your neck. Thankfully, they have removed the chain that linked your feet together, lessening your burden in your weakened state. You haven't eaten well since you left Numidia. Marius's henchmen had been instructed to keep you alive and healthy for the triumphal parade. Yet the sea voyage from Africa, the constant rolls and pitch of the quinquereme, have left you sick and unable to keep anything down. Once making landfall, your condition had not improved greatly, though only an hour ago your guards had forced you to eat a crust of hard bread and gulp down cups of water, presumably to ensure you could endure the ordeal of the day-long spectacle you were about to be the centerpiece of. You were certainly dressed for it. The Romans had obviously raided the closets at the palace of Cirta and found this garish, loud, and gaudy costume. You have no idea which of your long-dead kinsmen had ordered it made for themselves, though you suspected it could only have been your cruel and loud stepbrother Hiempsal's taste. A vest, leggings, and cape of leopard skin with intricate threads of pure gold and silver, peppered with jewels. A ridiculous outfit, contrived by a mind of a ridiculous man. You are glad you had Bomilcar kill him. Bomilcar. The thought of him causes you to halt before you are violently jerked forward by your chains. Yet the thought of him remains, as close to a brother as if he was your own blood, and yet you had had him killed. What else could you do? The information your spies had gained from the envoys of Metellus, coupled with the hoard of buried gold you had found on his land, had proven his guilt as a traitor. Yet in the year since, in your heart, you knew you had been wrong. He never would have betrayed you. You know that now. It must have been a Roman trick. But at the time, with the assassination attempts on you, the plots within plots, you would let your paranoia get the better of you and ordered him, your truest friend, killed. A stiff breeze from the chill morning air snaps you out of your lament, and you truly begin to take in your surroundings. You are being led past huge carts that serve as platforms, holding up massive double-sided murals that depict every battle Marius had fought in and led. The first, a massive wall of art showing Marius leading the final charge at the Battle of the Methul River. Your army had come so close that day to destroying the legions of Metellus, had it not been for the actions of Marius. So close. The next displayed the siege of Capsa, and for the first time you see how Marius pulled off that impossible feat. Capsa, the warrior heart of your kingdom, ripped out, with such ease, through a trick by using your own stolen cattle to draw the cult of Heracles out into the desert. You wanted to hate Marius for that, but you couldn't. It was simply too brilliant. Still, for the destruction of that holy city, you prayed that the gods would one day have their vengeance on Rome itself. You walk past still more huge murals, beautifully painted, as if the artist stole your regrets and your defeats from your dreams and cast them onto canvas. The details of each truly stunning, capturing the actions and battles of the legions perfectly down to the most minute detail. Marius must have paid a fortune for each one. As you are led past the murals for the Second Battle of Cirta, you see what should have been your moment of triumph, a depiction of you and the moment so lifelike that it sends a chill through you. You, at the center of the spearmen of the Royal Guard, about to engage the weak and exhausted North Army of Marius' square. Your saber is drawn, dripping blood, pointed at a centurion desperately organizing a defense from his exhausted maniple that had been engaged in combat all day. The caption written in Latin and then Greek has you yelling that it was useless for them to continue in battle, for you had just killed the consul, and your saber ran red with his blood. A tad dramatic, but it captured the essence of what you had said. In that moment you had been so close to victory. You remember the looks on the legionaries' faces. Then as your army engaged and you slew the first Hestatii you faced with ease, you saw it in his eyes. The lie that their beloved Marius was dead had broken their will to fight. Their morale was shattered. The next mural, a bird's eye view of the battle, shows Sulla and Marius leading their respective cavalry units on a charge that broke and destroyed your army. You can't help but shake your head at this rewriting of history before your eyes. It was Sulla's charge that saved the Romans. Marius had been far away, occupied fighting the pack of your screamers you had sent to hunt him down. You begin to wonder how the quaestor would feel about all this when you are jerked forward by your chains as your guard begins to move at a faster pace. You pass yet more murals, the last one depicting Marius being hailed imperator by his legions. Then you are hit by the smells and sounds of hundreds of animals from your homeland. A line of giraffes led by attendants with ropes, dozens of fine Numidian horsemen, leopards and lions in cages stacked upon carts, and finally war elephants. You recognize them, and the matriarch trumpets her greeting as she sees you, followed quickly by the rest. These mighty creatures had been trained by Balmokar. The great and wise beasts still recognize you as their king. Shame overwhelms you as your head sinks to your chest and your eyes well with tears. You continue to be pulled along until you reach the middle of the vast parade column, passing carts upon carts stacked high with your treasure and the vast wealth of your lost kingdom, until you are finally brought to a halt in front of the most magnificent chariot you have ever seen, painted blood red, decorated with golden eagles and intricate holy symbols. It is harnessed to 4 magnificent white stallions, groomed and brushed, their manes gleaming in the early morning sunlight. A familiar deep voice draws your attention. There was a time I thought you and I would always fight together as brothers, Jugurtha. You turn your head, and before you stands a demigod, dressed in a lavish purple toga, trimmed with thread of pure gold, his face painted red, and a delicate crown of laurel leaves adorning his oiled and well-coiffed head, pointing at you with an ivory scepter. It is his eyes that allow you to see past the opulent costume, and you realize it is Gaius Marius. He shakes his head in disgust. You have dishonored our mentor Scipio. Now look at you. You make no answer, because at the mention of Scipio Aemilianus you are flooded with guilt. Your relationship with your sworn brother floods your mind. The campaign in Hispania, Numantia, Scipio holding up your arm on the dais before the entire army and naming you champion of the legions and hero of the Republic, your farewell dinner in his command tent. Yet you know there is something missing. Something he did? No, something he said. What? Take him away, Marius says, and you are again pulled along. You go over every moment of your parting from Scipio, the food, the wine, the laughter, the bond between you. Yet just before you shared your farewell embrace, he had said something you know in your heart was profound. What? Why can't you remember? Your thoughts are disrupted by a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, dressed as a legionary, swinging a wooden toy gladius playfully at your thigh. Gaius, a gentle yet firm voice says, and the boy turns and runs back to a group of Roman nobles who had lined up to walk in the triumph. The woman leading them is impossibly elegant, She emanates class, and the sad smile she gives you as you are led past highlights her spectacular beauty. She could only be Julia Maria, and the boy, Gaius Marius the Younger, with their extended family making up the rest of the group. After a long walk of what must have been at least a kilometer, passing an entire legion, their armor shined and polished so that there was not a speck of dust, you are brought to a halt and placed in the lead of a group of chained Numidian prisoners. You can barely bring yourself to look at them, but you must. You see a few of your officers, all badly beaten, broken, their eyes black and swollen, so that you cannot tell if they notice you. But there is a pair looking directly at you, very young men, barely into their teens. You know them, of course. How could you not? Your sons, though you have to admit to yourself that it was more apt to say that you knew of them, for you have only met them a few times, having spent their entire lives away in your futile war against the Romans. You can't bring yourself to do more than nod at them before there is a blaring symphony of horns from the front of the column, and in seconds the entire length of the triumphal parade begins to walk forward. You and your countrymen behind you are pulled along by guards. As you move further ahead, you hear a vast, all-consuming roaring sound that could only be the people of Rome cheering the beginning of the parade as it enters the city. After what seems like hours of walking with your head down, your thoughts are once again consumed by trying to remember the words of Scipio Aemilianus at your parting. But it is as if they have been plucked from your mind by some denizen of Olympus. You try to turn inward and brace yourself for the spectacle that you are about to endure when you hear a different sound, solemn, sacred, holy. You look up to see a line of priests chanting prayers and blessing the parade as it proceeds. They mark the line of the Palmarium, an invisible holy barrier where no Roman leading men under arms could cross. As you listen to their words, you realize that they are not blessing the triumph, but rather beseeching Jupiter for his permission to allow Marius and his legions to enter the city under arms without calling down his wrath. As you approach the imaginary line sacred to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, a sense of foreboding comes over you. You feel as if to cross it will be the end of everything. Of course, everything has already been lost. And chained and shackled as you are, you have no choice but to go forward. Yet as you pass the line of priests and pass through the holy boundary, you are flooded with memories. You relive your entire life. Your boyhood with your loving uncle, King Micipsa, watching over you, learning to hunt with Balmacar, riding your first horse, being given the profound responsibility of leading the Numidian ala in Hispania, the Numantine campaign, the long siege, hunting the Celtiberians coming to relieve the city in the woods like they were animals, winning the love and respect of Rome's greatest general, the victory, the glory, the final parting with your sworn brother, and for the first time since he said them to you those many long years before, you hear the missing words. Even over the roar of the approaching crowd, you hear Scipio's voice as clearly as if he was standing next to you. It is dangerous, he says, to buy from a few what belongs to the many. You remember why he said that. You had given lavish gifts in the form of gold from your limitless purse, and if you are honest with yourself, bribes, to every Roman of high rank or low during the campaign. All the while he had watched you and said nothing. That heartfelt and dire warning that the Roman people would turn on you if you continued your ways was the best advice you had ever been given. How had you not remembered? How could you have gone on to bribe the rulers of the entire city many times over the years? It made no sense. How had you forgotten? You would never have rejected the sage advice from the man you respected more than anyone you had ever met. How? You are so consumed by the question that you barely notice that you have entered the city through the enormous triumphal gate. The ground turns soft and mushy beneath your feet, and you see that you are walking on flower petals that the now jeering crowd on either side of you had showered Marius with. You are pelted with rotten fruit and vegetables, and fluid you dare not imagine the origins of. You keep your eyes down and walk, consumed by one question. How had you forgotten? The coming hours have you led through the streets of Rome and into the Circus Maximus. The roaring here, if at all possible, is even more deafening, forcing you to raise your head and see a sight unlike anything you had ever believed possible. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Romans are seated in the stands, looking down at you in the triumphal parade as you make your way around the oval racing track. You give up counting how many times you circle the stadium. Then you exit and are marched around the Palatine Hill. You would not have thought it possible, but there are even more citizens and even their slaves stacked dozens deep on either side of the parade. Finally, you make your way to an inclined street you know from your previous visit to the city as the Via Sacra, the Sacred Way. Here the crowd is markedly different, reserved, impeccably dressed, both men and women glittering in their jewels. Where before the massive crowds had been plebs, here were the nobles, the optimates lined up according to their place in the hierarchy, with the most powerful being at the top of the long incline. As you walk further up the hill, you begin to recognize many of the men, now years older, your friends from the Jugurthine War. They don't jeer. Some have looks of intense hate. Others, a much more cutting look of bitter disappointment. You could almost laugh because you know you have bribed and made rich nearly every family you pass. But then you hear your sworn brother's words again and fall back into your despair. How had you forgotten? At the top of the Via Sacra, you see the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. You are brought to a halt and witness Marius get off his chariot and climb the dozen steps to a marble platform that leads into the temple. On either side of him are two white bulls being held in place by ropes tied around their necks and fixed to loops of metal bolted into the ground. Their long horns are covered in garlands of flowers. He nods and raises his arms. You are brutally pulled around so you face your sons and your last living followers. The guards that had led each one by their chains moves behind them. A horn is blown, and the guards loop garrots around their necks and pull with all their might. As you watch, your boys and your men are strangled to death. A mass human sacrifice to the king of Olympus. You retch and empty what little was in your stomach onto the ground. Again you are forcibly turned around, and a guard grabs you by the neck and forces you to watch as Marius draws his gladius and sacrifices first one and then the other white bull. Rivers of hot blood come flowing down their necks and down the white marble in torrents, and the animals collapse to the ground, their hearts still pumping. You feel as if you are about to collapse, are no longer able to stand, and are held up by your guards as you are carried away. Your last sight of Gaius Marius is of him dipping his hands in the blood of the bulls and marking the face of the statue of Jupiter. As your head rolls back, you look skyward and see an eagle soaring east before you pass out. You awaken with an unbelievable shock of pain. The guards are breaking your fingers to pull off your rings. You are on the dirty floor of a torchlit circular room. In the cool, damp air, you know you are in the bowels of some building. They pull you to your feet. Across the room, you see 3 evenly spaced pits, black holes in the ground. You know where you are. The Tullianum, the prison of Rome, where you had once bribed the guards to allow Bomilcar to escape after he carried out an assassination for you the last time you were in the city. Dread fills you as you realize that you will never see the sky again. You step backwards, only to feel your foot drop. One guard reaches out as if to grab you before you fall, but he instead takes a hold of a plain gold earring that rips free as you fall down into a pit of your own. As you fall, your last sight before you are enmeshed in the darkness of your pit is of the quickly vanishing earring as it catches the torchlight, and it sparks an impossibly distant early memory. You as a child of no more than 3 years looking up at an ancient old man, your grandfather, Massinissa, as he leans down from his throne and uses a razor-sharp spearhead to puncture your earlobe and places the earring in it. You remember the pain and how proud he looked when you did not cry out. Then you hit the ground hard, and the darkness no longer matters because the blackness takes you. 6 days later, 104 before the Common Era. Time has passed. A long time, though in the utter darkness you have no way of knowing how long. Your time spent in an alternating reality of intense and terrible fever dreams, reliving the mistakes of your life, seeing them,
feeling them. They are a dizzying torment, yet seem like a mercy, for when you wake, there is only pain, agony from your broken body. Yet even this is overshadowed now by a gnawing hunger so extreme, it is almost as if you can feel your body devouring itself. You are so weak that you can barely move. It is so dark that you cannot tell when your eyes are open. There is only one thing that you are certain of in this limbo of darkness and pain, and that is that the end is near. Each breath is becoming a labor, and you no longer have the energy for them. As you think you close your eyes, you ask, "Scipio, how could I have forgotten your words? I am sorry for all of this, my brother." And you drift, until, impossibly, there is a soft light, first a tiny speck in the distance, that grows and quickly surrounds you. You are laying exactly where you had been, but the ground is no longer stinking muck, but warm and soft grass. You hear good-hearted and friendly laughter coming from just behind you. You roll over with ease, amazed that there is no pain, no cold, no hunger, and when you look up, you see the all-too-familiar form of Scipio Aemilianus, in his glorious ceremonial armor, just as he had been the moment you had parted. He is covered in a nimbus of golden light, and is holding out his hand to help you up. He laughs again, the sound of it, the sound of him filling your broken heart with hope and joy. He smiles and says, "Jugurtha, have you not come to understand?" You give him a quizzical look. "We were all just pawns of prophecy. Come, brother, let me tell you a tale I've learned about a boy who found a clutch of 7 eagle's eggs." You reach out and take his hand, and pass on to what comes next. At least it might have gone like that. After the days of feasting and games that followed the lavish triumph, Consul Gaius Marius set about readying Rome to face the barbarian onslaught that was coming from the north. And during those same days, the noblemen of Rome approached Sulla with respect and even reverence, inviting him to dine with the elite in the most opulent of their villas. They lavished him with praise for his deeds in the war, and in quiet, whispered conversations, they planted the idea that it was only because of his deeds that Marius and his army of plebs had won the war, and that it was an insult that Sulla had not been given his due deference and acclaim for capturing Jugurtha. Sulla pointed out that during every other campaign in Roman history, the deeds of junior officers had by tradition always been seen as the deeds of the victorious general. They were one and the same. He had merely done his duty for the Republic, and Marius had been generous with the spoils of war. And soon Sulla began to listen to these elites, because he discovered that the tiny part of him that was still the broken, pathetic boy he had been before the love of Nicopolis had freed him from the chains of his insecurities, still wanted the adoration and acceptance of his class, the nobility, more than anything else. And the second he truly heard them out, took their point of view as his own, and began to see Gaius Marius as his rival, was the spark that would ignite a fire so intense that it would consume their entire world, and doom the Republic to fall to the Empire. Up next in Verses, the Patreon exclusive where we'll take a trip deep into the dark forest beyond the Alps. For while Marius and Sulla were in Africa, a barbarian horde was threatening Rome unlike anything since the time of Hannibal, and witnessed the Republic's worst defeat since the Battle of Cannae through the eyes of Quintus Sertorius, followed by a detailed episode about structural changes to the legions that would turn them into professional killing machines forevermore, the Marian reforms. Verses continues with the epic crossover, The Curse of Apollo's Gold, followed by the tie-in, Reforma, both serving as prelude to the titanic Cimbrian War, coming soon. Thank you for listening to Deep into History. Please go to patreon.com/deepintohistory. I could really use your help to keep the show independent and ad-free. There's also a new tier that comes with the most coveted shout-out in podcasting, so please consider becoming peerless. Also, leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and tell your friends about the show. This is an exciting time for me because grinding it out as an indie podcast, putting in so much work, and with all your amazing support, has put Deep Into History in a position where we threaten to knock corporate podcasts off the charts. You can follow the show on Twitter or Instagram at Deep Into History to get your daily blast from the past. And as always, my dear friend, take care of yourself. I truly look forward to the next time we go deep.